5 years ago, I moved into a new apartment. I was eager for a fresh start after a painful breakup. I was feeling pretty down, to tell you the truth. I wanted warmth, community, something to make me feel like I was alive again. That's what drew me to the little 5-unit building on the quiet street. It wasn't just the affordability or the location, it was the landlord. He was kind and warm, like the kind of dad I wished I had. He had an easy smile that made me feel like he was looking out for me. He told me he considered all his tenants to be family. And at that moment in my life, I needed family. That promise of belonging sealed the deal. Within a week, I had moved in, eager to rebuild my life. But soon after, odd things began to happen. It started subtly. I'd come home from work and feel like something wasn't right. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. My things weren't exactly where I'd left them. My books were slightly out of place, my toothbrush tilted at an odd angle. My closet door was just barely open when I knew I'd closed it, at least I thought I had. Small changes that you'd barely notice. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I was still frazzled from the breakup, or maybe work stress was getting to me. But the feeling wouldn't go away. Worse, it intensified. The sense of being watched became unbearable. It was a presence that wouldn't go away. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Sometimes, when I was lying in bed, I'd swear I heard movement. Just the faintest rustle, the creak of a floorboard, the softest sigh. I'd hold my breath, listening. But the silence always swallowed the sound. I told myself it was the building settling. That's what old buildings did, right? They creaked, they groaned, they played tricks on you. I clung to logic because I didn't even want to think about the alternative. Then my birthday rolled around. My boss was usually kind of a dick, but on that day he was in a good mood for some reason. When he realized it was my birthday, he told me to take the rest of the day off. I was surprised, but grateful. The idea of spending the afternoon alone, unwinding, sounded like a gift. When I got home, the first thing I noticed was the door. It wasn't open, it wasn't even cracked, but it was unlocked. A chill crawled up my spine. Had I forgotten to lock it? I had been scatterbrained lately, so it was possible. Still, I hesitated before stepping inside. The air in my apartment felt thick. Everything felt sinister for some reason. It felt like something bad was about to happen, but I told myself it was just my imagination. I shut the door behind me, trying to shake the unease curling in my gut. Everything looked normal. No signs of forced entry, no drawers rifled through, nothing missing, and yet I wasn't alone. I couldn't explain how I knew, but I did. A noise came from the bedroom. It was small, a whisper of movement, but in the suffocating silence it was deafening. My pulse spiked. I couldn't decide between fight and flight. I immediately tried to calm myself down. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the window was open and the breeze had knocked something over. Maybe a rodent had gotten inside. I stepped into the bedroom, my breath shallow. Everything looked in place. The bed was neatly made, the dresser untouched, but something was wrong. My gaze landed on the closet. The door was closed, but not all the way. A sliver of darkness gaped between the wood and the frame. A deep animal instinct screamed at me to run. But I had to know. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and yanked the door open. My landlord stood inside, his body wedged between my coats. For a moment, we just stared at each other. His face was eerily calm, like he'd been expecting this, like he belonged there. I couldn't breathe. My mind struggled to process the sight in front of me. The man who had welcomed me so warmly, who had promised me family, had been inside my home, hiding, watching. My paralysis shattered and I stumbled back, my heart pounding. My voice barely worked as I choked out, "What the hell?" He smiled. Not an embarrassed smile, not an apologetic one. It was something else, something knowing, something wrong. "I just wanted to make sure you were settling in," he said, his voice disturbingly even. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I turned and bolted. I didn't stop until I was inside my car, hands shaking as I fumbled with my keys. I locked the doors, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I didn't go back inside, not for my things, not for anything. I stayed in a hotel that night and called a moving company the next morning. I had them collect my belongings. I refused to step foot in that place again. When I called the police, they weren't much help. They said that the law said a landlord had to give 24 hours notice before entering a tenant's apartment, but there was an exception made for emergencies. The landlord was now claiming that an emergency was what made him enter. He said there had been a leak in a neighboring apartment and he needed to access my unit right away to make sure it wasn't flooded. I moved across town, somewhere bigger, somewhere brighter. I never spoke to him again. But sometimes, even now, I wake up in the middle of the night haunted by that feeling of being watched. And I wonder, if I hadn't found him that day, how long would he have stayed in the shadows waiting? "7 years ago, I moved into what I thought was the perfect apartment. It wasn't much, but it was affordable. The landlord was a kind, older man who lived in the unit next to mine. He treated the building like his home, because it was, and his tenants like extended family. I liked that about him. It made me feel safe. For years, everything was fine. Then his son Scott moved in. The guy was bad news from the start. The kind of man you instinctively avoid on the street. Hollow-eyed, always twitchy, always looking over his shoulder. He had friends too, the kind of people who never seemed to have jobs but drove nice cars and came and went at all hours of the night. I was pretty sure he was a drug dealer, but I didn't ask questions. I just kept my head down. Then my landlord died. His son inherited the building and things spiraled fast. The once quiet property became a revolving door for strangers. Shady men loitered outside at night, smoking, muttering to each other in hushed voices. Some of them would knock on my door at odd hours looking for Scott. The problem was there were no numbers on our doors anymore. They'd worn away over the years. My unit was apartment 2 and the son's unit was apartment 1. Without clear markings, these people didn't know where to go. I'd tell them they had the wrong apartment and they'd leave, but the fear lingered. The walls were thin. I'd hear muffled arguments in the hallway, fights in the dead of night, and things breaking. But the rent was cheap and I couldn't afford to move, so I stayed. Then one night everything changed. I was fast asleep when I heard a sound that jolted me upright. Someone was trying to break down my door. Before I could even process what was happening, the door burst open and a man in a black ski mask stood there, a gun in his hand. "Calvin needs you to pay up." I froze. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might explode. "I don't know any Calvin." "I don't know any Calvin," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "You've got the wrong place." He took a step closer, raising the gun. I could barely breathe. "This is apartment 2, I said quickly. You need apartment 1, next door. For a long, terrible moment, he didn't move. The gun didn't lower. I could feel the weight of his suspicion pressing down on me, suffocating me. I thought I was about to die. Then, without a word, he turned and left. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I grabbed my keys, my phone, and ran. I drove straight to a friend's house and didn't look back. I only returned the next day in broad daylight with a few other people to collect my things. I left the rest behind. I didn't care. I don't know what happened to the son or his operation. I didn't stick around to find out. All I know is that if that masked man had doubted what I said, I might not be here to tell this story. Cheap rent isn't worth your life. I never should have moved into that building. Looking back, I should have known something was off from the start. The too-good-to-be-true rent, the eerie quiet in the halls, the way the other tenants avoided eye contact when I first moved in. The tenants looked like the kind of folks who were there because no other building would have them for one reason or another, but I was desperate. The place I had before was falling apart, and this apartment, though old, at least seemed stable. Well, it seemed stable at first. The plumbing was an issue from day one. The pipes groaned like something was living inside them, something restless and angry. The toilet would gurgle at random hours, as if choking on something unseen, but I ignored it. It was just an old building, I told myself. Old buildings had their quirks. Then one night I woke up to the sound of rushing water. It took me a moment to understand what I was hearing, but when my feet hit the cold floor and I stepped forward, I felt it. Water, inch deep, spreading through my bedroom. My heart pounded as I rushed to the bathroom, only to find the toilet overflowing, spilling filth onto the tiles. The stench hit me like a slap. I grabbed towels, a mop, anything to stop the flood, but the water wouldn't stop. It kept pouring, dark and thick. It was like the apartment itself was vomiting something up from its depths. By the time my landlord arrived with his son and his wife, the entire bathroom was ruined. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that unsettled me, something I couldn't name. "Septic tank's backed up," he muttered. "We'll take care of it." And they did, sort of. It happened again a month later. Then again a few weeks after that. Each time the landlord and his family handled it. But the way they did it unsettled me. They worked in silence, moving too quickly, barely acknowledging my presence. And then one day the landlord pulled me aside. "It's your fault, you know," he said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "You use too much toilet paper." I almost laughed. I thought he was joking, but he wasn't. "All the tenants have agreed to stop flushing toilet paper," he said, his expression darkening. "We put it in the trash instead. I'm asking you to do the same." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline. It never came. I wanted to argue, wanted to tell him how insane that was. But something about his gaze made my throat go dry. His pupils were too wide, his expression too blank. He was watching me, studying my reaction like it was the most important thing in the world, so I nodded. There was no way in hell I was actually going to follow his rule. It was disgusting. And besides, how would he even know if I was flushing toilet paper or not? I found out soon enough. A few nights later, I woke to a sound outside my bedroom window, the dumpster. Something was rustling inside it. I crept to the window, lifted the blinds just an inch, and peered out. My stomach dropped. There, knee-deep in the trash, was my landlord. His wife stood beside him holding a flashlight, its beam sweeping over piles of discarded waste. They were searching for something. No, not just searching. They were inspecting. I watched, horrified, as my landlord pulled a trash bag open, reached inside, and sifted through the contents with his bare hands. His fingers closed around a clump of soiled toilet paper. He lifted it into the light, inspecting it like it held some kind of great, awful truth. I clapped a hand over my mouth, bile rising in my throat. The next morning, I barely made it to my door before he was there, stepping into my path, his face red, his breath heavy. "You lied to me," he hissed. I swallowed hard. "The septic tank," he jabbed a finger toward me. "You're the problem." "I checked all the garbage," he said. "Your bags are the only ones that don't have any toilet paper." "You're the one making us clean out the whole damn system again." His wife stood behind him, staring at me without blinking. Something was very, very wrong. I knew in that moment I had to leave. That day I put in my notice. I packed my things as quickly as I could, locking my bedroom door at night, double-checking the locks on my windows. I couldn't shake the feeling that my landlord was always watching, waiting. On my last night there, just before dawn, I woke to a noise outside my door, a soft rustling, then something slid underneath it. I held my breath, heart pounding. I waited until the footsteps faded, until the apartment fell silent again. Then slowly I got up and crept toward the door. A folded piece of paper sat on the floor. With shaking hands, I picked it up and unfolded it. Inside was a single crumpled square of toilet paper. And below it, written in smeared, jagged handwriting, "We know what you've done. We know what you've done." I left that morning. I just threw my last bag in the car and drove away without looking back.